Welcome to Believing the Word with author and pastor Dan Shunk. This program is a ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Here's what's coming up in today's message.
We identified there are nations that will be standoffish and they'll just stand down. And we were easily able to identify some of them. Some of them are a little more obscure. Saudi Arabia is clearly listed in there. Sheba and Dedan. Western Europe seems to clearly be mentioned in there. And then it talks about the young lions of Western Europe, which seems to be an indication to places like Canada, America, Australia, and others. And so these were nations in verse 13 that it just says we're going to stand off and just look and not get involved really one way or the other.
Have you ever watched what's happening around us and felt hopeless? Are you all too aware of the prophetic tipping point we are facing today? Does it make you fearful? Well, Christian, fear not. Ezekiel 39 reminds us that God is faithful to his promises, fulfills his prophecies, restores his people, and pours out his Spirit on those who belong to him. No matter how fierce the opposition, God's victory is certain. His presence is enduring, and his glory will be revealed to all. Neither Gog nor our sinful hearts can separate us from our Savior. So take heart, stand fast, and join us in Ezekiel 39 for part 2 of Pastor Dan's message, Final Attack, God's Victory over Gog.
Let's pick up where we left off, because that's what we do. Chapter 39 of Ezekiel is where we're at. A little bit unique in what we're going to do here tonight, because chapter 38 and 39 are completely interconnected. It is one story. It's one account of something that's happening. I don't like breaking things like that up, but had we done both these chapters together last week, we would have been there all night. So we had no choice but to break these up into two parts. But you will see I'm going to do a bit of an extensive recap of chapter 38 so that we can do chapter 39, because it is one account. So let's catch up to where we're at in the book. Up here to chapter 39, the 5 sections of Ezekiel right there on your screen. Ezekiel was called. He then prophesied to Judah, and then he also gave many messages to the foreign nations all around them. And now we're finishing up right now this 4th section of Ezekiel, in which he's prophesying of their future restoration. We've come through so many amazing things in this 4th section. Everything from we saw God promising to raise up new leaders for them, good leaders. And then he talks about bringing their land back into being fruitful again and productive, right into then where he's going to give them as a people a new heart and unify them even as a nation, bringing back together Judah and the northern kingdom of Ephraim, bringing them all back together into one nation. And all that is prophesied in this section. And we've made a big deal out of making sure we understand these things are happening in our lifetime. These things have truly come to pass in earnest in 1948 when Israel became a nation again. And now we're right on the cutting edge of these chapters of 38 and 39 happening, of this attack of Gog from Magog attacking Israel in the land with the help of all of their military forces that are with them. And that is what we've been dealing with here in chapter 38 and 39. So we're looking at 5 different parts of this attack from Gog's forces against Israel. The last time we were together, we saw the first 2 parts of it. And today in chapter 39, we're looking at the final 3 parts of this attack, things we need to recognize. Now, we're not going to do chapter 38 again, but I do want to remind you of these first 2 parts that we looked at throughout chapter 38, because if you don't know the players and the parts and the roles and what's happening, you're going to be completely lost for chapter 39. So this is just one of those times that we just have to recap the last chapter. So as we began chapter 38 the last time we were together, we first started by identifying the key players, places, and what was prompting them to come and attack Israel in the land, coming soon to a theater near you. In a real life theater. We talk about military theaters. Yeah. So we've identified Gog of Magog, this person of this place, Gog of Magog, as the Russian leader. Look, all of these things, I'm not going to prove them to you right now. We did that last time, but take my word for it right now, or go back and get the message from last time. So we walked through the Bible and through history to determine how we can know all of these different players that are in the scriptures. How can we know Gog is Russia? We talked about that. How can we know Persia is Iran? We talked about these things. And so go back and get the last message to explain all those things. We identified who Meshach and Tubal are. They are some of the nations mentioned as coming with Russia in support of this attack. And we talked about Meshach and Tubal and Gomer and Togarmah as the countries that are what today is modern Turkey. And so Russia together with modern Turkey and Iran, as well as some African countries from Libya possibly and Sudan coming to help Russia in this attack. Very interesting that this coming Sunday, we're actually doing, part of what we're doing on Sunday is Psalm 83. And in all the prophecy circles, that is a very significant psalm because many commentators will actually put Psalm 83 as a last days prophecy. But when you talk to people that are in Israel, that you have to quickly recognize that there's an attack mentioned in Psalm 83, and you have to recognize that the nations of Psalm 83 that's attacking Israel are all of the surrounding nations immediately around Israel. It's this inner ring of fire. And I would tell you that those nations, that attack, I'm going to spoil it for Sunday, that attack from Psalm 83 has already happened. That's already been happening from 1948 up through the Yom Kippur War, which was actually the largest attack against Israel ever, was in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And so through those decades and years, I believe Psalm 83 was fulfilled, that all of those nations were beat back. In fact, Israel is still subduing all of them. They're just minor players now. I mean, none of the nations immediately around Israel now have the capability of even harming them today, but they're trying. But this attack we're looking at here in Ezekiel 38 and 39 is not these immediate surrounding nations. It's these far-reaching nations, Russia, Iran, Turkey, Sudan, and all that. And so we talked about that in chapter 38 here, verse 1 through 3. And then we got down to verses 4 through 12 of chapter 38, and we identified the rest of the nations like Iran and Ethiopia, Libya, the rest of Turkey. We also in that section identified what's prompting Russia to make this attack that's going to happen, how they're seeking financial gain. It's two different references to how they're coming to take a spoil, that is what's motivating them. And we actually talked about what that could potentially be. We went beyond the Bible for just a second. We took a speculative shot at this, and we said that there's a large interest, a large conflict really between Israel and Russia right now with all of the natural gas and who's going to be able to sell it to Europe and who's going to be able to pipeline it to Europe. And so we talked about some of those things the last time and what's prompting Russia. And then we got down to verse 13, and that kind of finished that first section. And we identified that nation. There are nations that will be standoffish, and they'll just stand down. And we were easily able to identify some of them. Some of them are a little more obscure. Saudi Arabia is clearly listed in there. Sheba and Dedan. Western Europe seems to clearly be mentioned in there. And then it talks about the young lions of Western Europe, which seems to be an indication to places like Canada, America, Australia, and others. And so these were nations in verse 13. And it just says we're going to stand off and just look and not get involved really one way or the other. And so we started there and identifying all of these players. And then for the second half of chapter 38, then we identified God's plan. What is God doing in all of this? God's plan, God's activity. In verses 14 through 17, we spoke about how God has already prophesied of this Russian attack. He already knows all about this. We went back to Numbers chapter 24, and we looked at that prophecy of God coming to attack Israel in the last days. Verses 18 through 20 of this chapter, we saw God using an earthquake to defeat the Russian-led forces when this attack happens. And yet, even at that time, it talks about how even worldwide events will begin to be happening at that very time when this attack happens, and God starts to confuse them with an earthquake. And then the chapter finished up in verse 21 through 23, we see hail and fire and brimstone and things falling from heaven. And it does seem to be a pretty strong indication that we're talking about some type of chemical, biological, nuclear type of warfare that begins to happen in an exchange of warheads and weaponry. So We're going to transition now. Now we're going to jump into the second half of this in chapter 39. But there's something interesting that you have to recognize about this. This chapter 39 is not just a continuation of the account from chapter 38. I wonder when the last time is you read Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, because it is the exact same thing. Have you ever read Genesis 1 and 2 and you're like, wait a second, is he repeating himself? What's he doing here? He's kind of telling the same thing, but it looks different in Genesis 2 than Genesis 1. Do you remember that as you read that? I'm not going to call you out, but you've read that, right? Okay. All right. Well, this is the same way. This is a Hebrew literary device that's utilized in which we in the West, we write things chronologically. That's what we do. Here was the beginning of the story. She met the boy. And then in the middle of the story, they had some kind of awkward encounter. And then it gets towards the end, and no, they really like each other. And then by the end of the story, it's the end of the story. They get married, and everybody lives happily ever after, right? That's the way we write. It's right in order chronologically. I did that for the benefit of one in the room. But anyway, so that's the way we write. That's not the way they did it in Eastern literature. When they wrote in order of importance. That was their method of writing. They would write things down. Look, this is super important. And then they're like, oh, now that I got that off my chest, let me give you some more details about that. And that's what we have in Genesis 1 and 2. That's what we have here in Ezekiel 38 and 39. So if it looks like in chapter 39, he's going back to the beginning of the story almost, he kind of is. He's going back now and he's intending to give further details about this event. So if that makes sense to you, we're ready to jump in to chapter 39. And that was officially the longest introduction I've ever done. All right, so let's do it. So I'm going to begin now by saying here's our third point, because it just truly is one and the same as what we were looking at last week. So we're looking at all these different parts of this attack. And as chapter 39 begins, now we're going to see the scope of this third attack. We're going to identify the scope of Gog's attack against Israel. And let's be careful we don't confuse that. It's not God's attack. It's Gog, the nation who was originally founded by this man Gog. Okay, I'm emphasizing the G to make the point. Okay. All right. So chapter 39, we begin in verse 1. Now, as for you, son of man, prophesy against Gog and say, thus saith Lord Yahweh, behold, I am against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Of course, again, Russia, who's leading Turkey in this case. And in verse 2, I will turn you around and drive you on. Another way of saying that is I will drive you into confusion, is really the words. I will turn you around. I will drive you in confusion. I will take you up from the remotest parts of the north and bring you against the mountains of Israel. Doesn't it kind of give you the flavor that we're starting the story over, right? And that's kind of what we're doing. And he's going to give some different details this time. So this expression here in verse 2, I'm going to turn you around and drive you on. First of all, it's interesting that it says I'm going to turn you around. It's the beginning of the story, and he says I'm going to turn you around. It seems to be an indication in the language that Israel has another motivation at the time. There's something else they're involved with, but God says, no, I want you to go attack Israel now. God allows that to happen. So is it that they're still involved in Ukraine? Is it that they're still doing something else? And God says, nope, this is the time. Take a different direction. You're going to go down now towards Israel. Drive you on. Drive them into confusion. The words, these words actually come from the literal words of a sixth. So you may have a translation that says, I will leave but a sixth part of you. Maybe you have a translation that says that. That's that's the literal meaning of the words. And what it means is, I'm going to drive you to confusion. It doesn't necessarily mean there will just be a sixth part of them left. It means I'm going to cause a great confusion or a scattering. The words are talking about an annihilation by confusion is the idea. And when it says there, then in verse 2, I'm going to bring you against the mountains of Israel. This isn't just some analogy, is the point. This isn't just some, computer warfare only. or, only, shutting down cyber things. No, this is a literal military attack. And God makes that clear in chapter 38 and here, that you're coming against the land. You're coming to the very land. It's a very literal military attack. Make no mistake about it. In verse 3, and I will strike your bow from your left hand and cause your arrows from your right hand to fall. You will fall on the mountains of Israel, you and all your troops and the peoples who are with you. Interesting, even here, right? Because we've been talking about how this isn't just a Russian attack. This is a Russian-led coalition of many nations. Even here in verse 4, I'm going to cause you and your troops. But then it also says, and the people who are with you. So even there, it's making it very, very clear. This isn't just one nation's attack, but it's their attack. Oh, and also all the other nations that are with you. Every step of the way, we're getting that kind of confirmation. Continuing verse 4, I will give you as food to every kind of predatory bird and beast of the field. You will fall on the open field, for it is I who have spoken, declares Lord Yahweh. Remember, by the way, and we mentioned this last time as well in chapter 38, it does no injustice to the text to be able to interpret the words like bow and arrow as words like missile and missile launcher. That does not do any injustice to the text. We talked about that last time. These are timeless ways of expressing a launcher and an arrow of some kind. In fact, isn't it fascinating that one of the more sophisticated modern weapon systems is actually called the arrow? I find that fascinating. Maybe the Lord knew that. He's like, I'm going to put it in there. It'll be a double meaning. Maybe. Very fascinating stuff. So it's okay to recognize that the Lord may have just put that in there as timeless language, but he knows exactly what it is that's going to happen. Verse 6, and I will send fire upon Magog. Wow. Wait a second. What is that again? Gog is the leader of the place of Magog. Gog is this leader of Russia. Magog is actually the Russian territory itself, right? So he's going to send a fire upon Magog, the land of Magog, the place of Russia. This is new information. We didn't get this in the last chapter. In the last chapter, we're talking about this attack against Israel, in Israel, by Gog and his forces. And now we see in verse 6, I'm going to send a fire upon Magog and those who inhabit the coastlands securely, and they will know that I am Yahweh. Verse 7, and my holy name I will make known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let my holy name be profaned any longer. And the nations will know that I am Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel. Verse 8, behold, it is coming, and it shall be done, declares Lord Yahweh. This is the day of which I have spoken. In other words, I told you it was coming, and it's coming. And so we see a fire coming into the very land of Russia, but also to the coastlands. God brought this battle to Israel, but God brought the battle to Russia. In whatever capacity, however this happens, it doesn't tell us, but there seems to be an exchange between Russia and these coastlands living securely. Now, we already have a high reason to interpret last chapter where it talked about Western Europe and all the young lions thereof. We already have a high probability to interpret that as America. There's no reason to not think that this is talking about the same thing. It's either Western Europe and Russia or it's America and Russia, but there's some distant nation that is doing some type of exchange with Russia, which will lead to fire falling from the sky. Now, we don't know exactly how this is going to happen. I don't think the Lord necessarily needs us to know exactly how this is going to happen. Some of the reason some of these things are in here is so that when it comes to pass, what? You will know that I am Yahweh. I told you ahead of time. Remember that we don't have to know exactly how the Lord is going to fulfill every one of these prophecies for this to be important and for this to be amazing. I'll give you the analogy we've given before. It's the same as my password. If I say to you, my password is a mystery, you don't know my password, but it's kind of like this, and I start describing it to you, and you're like, okay, I could take a guess, but I don't really know what it is. It's murky. It's foggy. You don't really know. But the moment then I reveal it to you and I say, oh, here it is. Here's my password. Then, oh, now I get it. right? So that when you finally get it, you'll know that that's my password and I gave it to you. This is the same idea. The Lord is saying, look, I'm going to give you all these clues. I'm going to give you information for the general idea of how this is going to happen. But when it happens, you'll know it was me, because you'll see all of these characteristics coming to pass. You'll see them happen, and then you'll have no excuse but to say, wait, this is exactly what the Lord talked about. Right? So whether these coastlands or Europe or America or whatever, when there is some exchange in which fire falls on Russia and the coastlands, everybody around, including specifically Israel, will be like, this is definitely what he talked about right here. So if this doesn't describe a nuclear exchange between the USA and Russia, I don't know what does. This gets certainly the closest to that, but we don't know for sure that that's what this is. But please notice, one of the important things here is that these things are affecting the whole world. This Russian attack against Israel is affecting everyone. That he says in verse 7, so that the nations will know that I am Yahweh. Remember back in last chapter in verse 20, it said in verse 20 that the whole earth would quake. Some type of earthquake that's shifting everything. In fact, there's a lot of good information to think that that might be what the Lord uses to reestablish paradise on earth. There's good information that seems to indicate that part of what might have happened at the time of the flood is the axis of the earth shifted, which creates the seasons. The earth is at a perfect 23 1/3 degree tilt right now, which causes the seasons on the planet. If we didn't have that tilt, we wouldn't have seasons. And the earth could be in a perfect paradise. So maybe that's what's going to happen here. There's also, look up the wobble effect, how the earth is in a wobble right now. Have you ever spun a top and you're spinning the top and then all of a sudden at some point in the spin, it wobbles and it can recover from that, or it can wobble and then die, right? So many scholars tend to think that the earth that's spinning right now is going to go into this wobble that will cause these earthquakes, and then it will correct itself back at a perfect tilt again. So it could be exactly what the Lord's going to use. We know the Lord is calling for an earthquake all over the earth, and that could be one of the ways he does it. We'll find out. We'll watch from the balcony. Okay, if you're a believer, you'll watch from the balcony with me, but we will see how the Lord chooses to do these things in that day. I want to be clear. Many of these end times events we're going to watch from the balcony. We don't know exactly when this attack is going to happen, whether that is just before the rapture or just after. And somebody asked me that question, and we're going to get to that in just a second. So let's press on into verse 9. Yes, and this is actually about the part where we're going to start talking about the timing of all this. Verse 9. This goes into the next part, the fourth part of what I want to talk about. We talked about the scope of this attack and how it's going to affect the coastlands and the Russian homeland and everything. Well, now starting in verse 9, now we're going to see Gog's intentions are turned backwards. Everything they came to do is repelled, and that comes out now starting here in verse 9. Then those who inhabit the cities of Israel will go out, and they will make fires with the weapons and burn them, both shields and large shields. You might have shield and buckler there. Bows and arrows, war clubs and spears. And for 7 years they will make fires of them. They will not carry wood from the field or gather firewood from the forests, for they will make fires with the weapons. And they will take the spoil of those who made them into spoil, and they will seize the plunder of those who plundered them, declares Lord Yahweh. What great irony here. I mean, it's just like the Lord to take an enemy's attack and turn it around the exact opposite. Oh, you came to take a plunder? Well, guess what? Israel's going to benefit from your invasion. You know, that's just like the Lord. Isn't that right, Haman? Okay, you get the point. So go back and read Esther. I love that. How the Lord at any minute can just turn things exactly backwards and say, oh, you meant harm? Oh, I'm going to turn it for good. Isn't that exactly what's said by Joseph of old? Do you remember that story? Joseph sold into slavery. And after Joseph and the brothers' father dies, the brothers start getting this indication like, oh man, now Joseph's going to get his revenge for when we sold him into slavery and you know, we got rid of him. We told dad he was dead. Now he's going to want to get his revenge. And so they come begging up to their brother, you know, Prince Joseph, after their father dies. And they're like, listen, so you're going to treat us nice, right? That's my paraphrase. And what was Joseph's answer? You meant these things for evil, but God meant it for good, to send me ahead, to prepare the way, to preserve life. And so God knows how to take things that are meant for evil and just flip the script and turn it around. I think it's good for us to remember that. The next time we feel like somebody's attacking us, the enemy's attacking, the world's attacking, our own flesh is attacking, the Lord knows how to just completely 180 that the other direction. And that's exactly what happens to Russia right here.
You've been listening to Believing the Word, a ministry of author and pastor Dan Shunk at Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Pastor Dan has been teaching through a series in the book of Ezekiel. We'd love to get connected with you and hear about how God is working in your life through this teaching program. You can reach us by phone at 717-500-1102. Again, that number is 717-500-1102. You can also check us out at our website at ccchambersburg.org, where you can learn more about the ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg and find our chapter-by-chapter messages. If you're in the Chambersburg area, we'd love to have you join us Sunday mornings and Thursday evenings on 5121 Coffee Avenue. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back with more from the book of Ezekiel. But until then, this has been Believing the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk.